Hi everyone. So, as you may have noticed from my video on YouTube about um, objective personality versus socionics with Binyamin Tsadik, it is pretty dang long. It's like 3.5 hours, and I'm sorry it was as long as that. I found the conversation quite interesting. I found it quite exploratory, but as a result, it didn't have a lot of focus, and it didn't really get as much to the point as I would have liked. Although at the same time, discovering a new theory was very interesting for me. Discovering these different parts and different pieces of knowledge which I can get from Binyamin was especially valuable and interesting to me. And I found during that conversation that actually having an exploration rather than a debate would be more productive in the long run, rather than trying to hammer home points on someone when, well, I hadn't explored the issue to its fullest. Maybe that's more of a type bias of me, which would make sense, more of an extroverted intuition thing, rather than sticking to more to the extroverted sensation of trying to, I don't know, hold someone up by their ankles and give them a shake. But I don't know, that's sort of who I am to some degree. So, sorry a bit for people who are waiting for a more direct debate. I think it might be worth organising something a bit more formalised, a bit more structured, just so that we can actually have that sort of more formal debate format. So I think that is something I'd like to approach Binyamin in the future for, or anyone else, maybe Dave or Shannon. Now, I just wanted to give a few thoughts about the discussion I had with Binyamin. Now, it was interesting in some ways. I don't think we got as far as I would have liked, which is evident given the amount of time we spent on it. It was a bit difficult really to find main sticking points. There are bits of Binyamin where he seemed to be agreeing with what I was saying, but at the same time he also said almost the opposite of what I was saying in different places. It was really hard to tell what he was agreeing on and what he wasn't agreeing on, or just thought it wasn't particularly relevant, so he said, "Oh, okay," and would shrug his shoulders. So I didn't really feel there was as much of a proactive attempt on both sides to really get to the nub of the issues. And maybe just our very differing approaches. I think there's a great difference in socionics extroverted intuition between the two of us, and probably also in objective personality extroverted intuition, which may have led to very differing approaches. It's interesting though that to find that there were a good number of similarities. For instance, in terms of myself probably being the same type in the two systems, in terms of, to a degree, the different things they managed to find just had assigned in different areas. Like, for instance, the idea of, say, double deciders. This idea that you have, if you have a focus on, say, extroverted intuition as your leading function or your dominant function, that supporting that would be a sort of more balanced introverted thinking, introverted logic, and extroverted ethics, extroverted feeling. And so that would create more of a balanced sort of jack of all trades effect. So that was interesting to explore in some other areas. Now, what I think it'd be good to run through some of the main points of contention that still exist. So there are some of these points, most of these points I did raise in the discussion, and I don't think Binyamin really had a very clear answer to them. At some points I gave more of a charitable explanation to try to make sense of what he was saying to some degree. So I think it's worth just going through some of those. So one of the main points was essentially the objectivity of objective personality. It's something which I find was also always a bit contentious, this idea that a personality theory was somehow more objective than other personality theories. And I would like to be clear that I'm not talking about the attempts at a more objective methodology, which I think is entirely admirable. The idea of having cross-checks, having independent typing in different rooms, the attempts to put together a system of coins, as it were, dichotomies. These are all good things. The coins may be less of a good thing after thinking about it more, but certainly the cross-checking. But also, such methodology is not intrinsic to objective personality over any other personality theory. You could do exactly the same thing with sociology. You do exactly the same thing with looser pan-Jungian or Myers-Briggs theories or Enneagram or any other. There's nothing intrinsic to a personality theory, that is how it is then diagnosed, what methodology you decide to use which works best. They're different things. And the objectivity I wish to question is the personality theory itself, its own theoretical infrastructure. That is what I think is something which remains to be questioned in terms of its objectivity. And it seems to me that that is something which is less than what is claimed. Now, the reason I say that is because there is this theoretical background. It's clearly using Jungian terminology, and at the same time volunteering certain terms to describe different concepts, such as self versus tribe, such as organizing versus just taking in or accumulating. These sorts of ideas, even the use of intuition, sensation, thinking, feeling. If you're being truly objective, there's only really one way you can be truly objective, and that's to take the more big five route. Do something like a factor analysis. See how the concepts actually line up in reality, perhaps through the lexical method. Even that is not fully flawless. The lexical method can be flawed because our use of language can be flawed. But nonetheless, there is some sort of close to objective as possible truth there. Whereas actually having these terminologies in the first place, I think, puts objective personality on just a sort of subjective footing as any other typology system. The only difference, I think, is that there is less of a route towards, or a link towards, commonly recognized types, commonly recognized tropes and themes, which I'd say sociologics has an advantage in that it is based very much in these collectively understood themes. When I mean that, I mean, say, the certain archetypes, certain stock characters, certain ways of looking at people, distinct types that people immediately recognize. It's why I spent some time on the unofficial objective personality group, putting up examples of, say, Winnie the Pooh, for instance, or Sancho Panza, or if you were to look at, say, Montgomery Burns, Homer Simpson, the Pantalone from Commedia dell'arte. These sorts of very stock characters, which all, many of them have certain uncanny similarities. And as soon as you recognize that certain sort of character, whether it's a sort of plump, easygoing, likes to eat, likes to have fun, doesn't like to take things too seriously, that sort of personality, you see it immediately, you can recognize it. There's a truth to that because people readily recognize it, and people in creating fiction actually create fictional characters who are like this. They're so instantly recognizable. Or at the same time, the more sort of money-grubbing, more ambitious, perhaps more harsh, more pragmatic sort of figure. Again, that's something which we often see, we often clearly recognize these tropes. And that's something which sociologics has always had a very clear link to. You can clearly see these characters in real life, in both real life but also in fiction. And the fiction is itself a distilled version of the real life, of what we've encountered, what we've come to recognize, what we come to collectively accept. It's what Jung was talking about in the collective unconscious, the use of these archetypes. So sociologics, although I would not say it's objective, and I wouldn't say objective personality is any more objective, I say that sociologics has a certain edge here, in that it is taking its ideas from these sort of stock characters and archetypes, as well as observations of people in real life. Austra Agustina Vizziuti was putting together sociologics from observations of people and how they interacted and their relationships. That you could see that in her reason for starting in the first place, trying to understand her relationship with her husband, who was her benefactor. So it's not as if objective personality is taking a thoroughly different approach to sociologics in terms of having some observations and at the same time applying more arbitrary logical categories or criteria or names or terminologies to understand the things which they're then observing. And again, not using any sort of factor analysis, not using any sort of closer to foolproof empirical methodology. So yeah, I'd say objective personality, like socionics, is somewhere between the objective and subjective. And when I was raising these points with Binyamin, he didn't really have anything convincing to say in response to that. I think he sort of ended up shrugging at that. It was, yeah. And there's also one point which I raised was about if objective personality really is to be objective in how it understands these different types, how it observes them, it really ought to have some sort of peer-reviewed journal article. It should have a clear methodology, and it should then run tests with statistics, and it should actually submit those experiments to some sort of journal where it can actually be peer-reviewed. And this was dismissed rather quickly by Binyamin, and had also been dismissed by other people on the unofficial objective personality group. There seemed to be a certain hostility to the ideas of peer review. Now, I take the point that peer review in and of itself is not a cure-all for fallacies in objective methodologies, but it is something which is a pretty important first step. And without these sorts of peer-reviewed journal articles, the only reason why you would say that objective personality is more objective than any other personality system is because you're putting your trust in the abilities of Dave Superpowers and Shannon, to conduct these experiments with some sort of uncanny accuracy more than anyone else, more than any other practitioner in any other kind of typology theory, which is a very large ask. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's also something which, rightfully, in my opinion, attracts a great deal of skepticism and a great deal of questioning. And what do you do for such questioning? You can say you have some sort of process, but we're not talking about the process for typing. We're talking about the very concepts themselves. What causes concepts to be put together? And if you were to ask David Shannon, okay, what did you do to actually put together these concepts and find them showing up objectively in some sort of reality? They wouldn't have anything really to show for it. They wouldn't have the data collected there in front of you. They wouldn't have the studies. You wouldn't have anything peer-reviewed to show that it's actually working. So that is where I think that objective personality isn't really as objective as it's suggesting it is. It is misrepresentative. It is getting the point about its objectivity, where that is true, is when it's trying to be more objective in its methodology for then trying to work out a type using these cross checks, which I think is, as I've always said, is perfectly admirable and something which other typology theories, if they have the resources, should also do. Socionics also has had people who try to do this, but it's difficult to always generalize the diagnostic methodology for socionics, because rather than being just two people who are in a committed relationship, it's many tens of different schools that are trying to do this together, in different ways, different shapes, different forms. Some in Moscow, some in Kiev, some in the West, like for instance World Socionic Society, and that is going to be something which is. So you can't really generalize. You can't treat socionics as a monolith, whereas you could treat objective personality as a monolith. Now, so that's my point about objectivity. Another point I'd like to make is looking at some of the particular terminologies that have been decided upon and have been used, particularly one of the most fundamental ones. So the idea of objective personality when you're diagnosing is that you're using these coins. These coins usually occur in a certain order. You have to determine if someone is a double decider, which means also a single observer, or else a double observer, thereby a single decider. The idea being that a double decider is someone who has a perceiving function first, and then second and third in the four-function stack, you'd have two judging functions, and then the last one down at the bottom would be another perceiving function, which would be sort of ignored or just not used nearly as much, pushed towards one side. So, or vice versa, a single decider would have two perceiving functions in the middle, one judging function at the top, one far smaller judging function at the bottom. So, and then once you've decided that, the next coin is basically looking at, okay, which one's which? Is it extroverted judging? Is it introverted judging if someone's a judger, if they are definitely a single decider, thereby a double observer? You need to find out what sort of functions at the top is extroverted or introverted. And they work that out by saying, is that thing tribe or is it self? Is it some sort of judgment, some sort of decision made towards the tribe or towards the self? This is where I get a bit lost in terms of how this makes sense. So for that to work, for you to work out, even before you've worked out whether it's extroverted feeling or extroverted thinking, you had to have worked out if it is tribe or self. So in other words, there is something which both extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling have in common, and that thing in common must be something to do with a tribe. Now, that's confusing, because if you think about it, when you talk about a tribe, you're talking about a collection of people. You're talking about the group. You're talking about the group mentality, what people are sharing together in some sort of community. Now, if you know much about Jungian psychology, it becomes very clear that that's something which would most likely apply to extroverted feeling across most Jungian typologies, socionics, Myers-Briggs, certainly, and of course in objective personality. But the point is, this does not seem nearly as obvious when it comes to extroverted thinking. And there are other typologies which have said almost the opposite. Extroverted thinking is actually often quite independent. It's not about people, it's about the facts, it's about practicality, what is shown to work. And by following what is shown to work through observation of how things work in reality, you can often go against public opinion. So there's a disconnect there. And I'm there thinking, okay, you need to make a really strong argument for why extroverted thinking should be just as much tribe as extroverted feeling. And that's quite difficult. And I asked Binyamin about this. He didn't have a very clear answer to this. I asked other people about this. Also didn't have a very strong answer. Binyamin said, oh, well, extroverted thinkers, if you really talk to them, they want to do whatever works the best. And what works the best is what works the best for society. Now, that is a big leap. That's a jump. Why does working the best have to be what works the best for a particular tribe or society? What has the group? Why do you have to identify the group to be the ideal user of extroverted thinking? If extroverted thinking is, and most people say extroverted thinking has something to do with sort of seeing how things work, taking the facts, seeing how things actually play out in reality, rather than relying on more conceptual schema and frameworks, just seeing how the processes actually work in reality, which is what Jung was talking about, was contrasting Charles Darwin as an extroverted thinking type to Nietzsche, who was more of an introverted thinking type. If you're taking those Jungian concepts, nothing about that necessitates being oriented towards the tribe, not unless you define the tribe completely differently to how you define the tribe of extroverted feeling. If the tribe is not a tribe of people, but a tribe of factual processes, then yeah, I guess that makes sense, but then why call it the tribe? When you think of a tribe, you're thinking of a people. Whenever you say the word tribe to people, they think of people. It becomes strangely incongruous. It sticks out, and it's unusual and counterintuitive. And how you would then be expected to then rely on this when actually doing typing is very bizarre. So this is like the second coin you'd be looking at, right? So in your typing process, assuming you've come across someone who's an observer, a single observer rather than a single decider rather than a single observer. So it's the second coin, right? Your second step, and you now have a coin which very clearly applies to one possibility, but doesn't really apply very well to the other one. It's only really half on one, and it's half very much on one, and slanted towards that direction, the feeling direction, and very much slanted away from the thinking direction in terms of how well it actually applies. The only way you could try to make it apply is make some sort of very forced, very stilted argument, which requires some leaps of logic. That's a big flaw. It's supposedly an objective personality theory, right, with a methodology using these coins, and your second coin is a bit faulty. It's a bit hit and miss. How can you rely on that for typing people? Now, of course, we know that Dave and Shannon have a 90% assessor reliability. It's pretty good, very impressive. But we've seen that happen before. Podler had that. Cognitive typology also has a similar level of reliability. Because at the end of the day, having inter-tester reliability is not the same as actually having structures and terminologies which represent the salient characteristics of personality type. All that tells you is that they are seeing something. They're seeing something. That could be anything. You could see small twitches in one's face. You can see warm wizard hands. Yes, fine, you can see the warm wizard hands, as we saw in Podler. That doesn't mean it has any necessary or salient connection to personality. It could be completely meaningless, it could be completely arbitrary, but you've seen it, and you see it reliably. So seeing something reliably does not make something an important and salient personality characteristic that's useful for actually determining some sort of Jungian type. So, yeah, it leads a lot of questions, a lot of areas to worry about when you're thinking about this use of tribe. And a faulty coin, especially right at the beginning, if you're using a system of coins, shows one, the flaw in the process, but also the flaw in having coins. If you're going to have coins, you need to have the most reliable, foolproof methodologies right at the front. There can't be any room, there can't be any way it can be questioned. If you can question it, then it's not a good coin to have at the front. In socionics, we don't use these sorts of coins. We actually do have some sorts of coins, depending which school. For WSS, we like to use the quadras as our first coins. We like to see, okay, are they world accepting versus world rejecting? Are they integrity seeking versus clarity seeking? We find that pretty reliable after a while, after seeing what they're saying about their values. But the reason why we use that, rather than these more, what I say, temperament-oriented coins, EJs, EPs, IJs, IPs, the reason we use that rather than those temperament coins is because temperaments are placeholders for information elements, for cognitive functions. It's a cognitive function which actually has the content, the real meat of meaning for telling things apart. It's those which connect up to all these different archetypes in our collective understanding of seeing different tropes, different figures in our shared fictions. So why on earth would you go to the placeholders first? That suggests you are attributing meaning to empty vessels, more meaning than it's truly deserved. When we look at these containers, these, say, extroverted rationality, all we can say is that there's something which is rational and it's sort of dynamic in the socionics view. And, when you say, okay, what does rational and dynamic look like? Some people try to describe the temperament. It doesn't really necessarily work. All you can say is, okay, there's lots and lots of accumulated shoulds going on, which isn't very particular, not very specific to a set of behaviors. It only really comes to life when you start using the information elements. Are they using extroverted ethics? And which is academically similar to extroverted logic in terms of, the accumulation of oughts and shoulds, which change from situation to situation. But what people are really looking to, and what is really meaningful, is that extroverted ethics is about the emotional energy. It's about raising emotional states, amplifying that, making people feel that things are really great. And extroverted logic is the opposite. It is about cutting out the emotionality and going to the facts, seeing what is practical, seeing what actually works, and realistically conveys the facts of how things actually turned out. Those are opposites. The whole point of these information elements that they are exact opposites. You shouldn't be emphasizing how they're similar, you should be emphasizing how they're different, and how they may be the same is more academic and mathematical. So now I know that's me criticizing objective personality from my own point of view, which is sociology is not always very good. So I'd rather focus on the fact that if this coin is faulty, if you have difficulty determining that extroverted thinking is just as much about tribe as extroverted feeling, and it obviously is difficult, you can't have a clear argument, it isn't clearly obvious to people, then there's something wrong with your methodology. There is a flaw there, and it can go horribly wrong. Okay, so that's what I like to say about tribe versus self. I should also say that by doing this, by making extroverted thinking about tribe, I have found that talking to people in the group, those people who were typed extroverted thinking, a lot of them weren't really showing much sign of the more fact-oriented, pragmatic side. Instead, they were really focusing on the tribe-y element and doing things, and instead their actions were conveying much more about doing things for the sake of others, rather than focusing on how facts play out in reality. So it seemed to me that people are now being typed based on tribiness, rather than being typed based on something which is more independently extroverted logic. And it seems to me that what Dave and Shannon would do is, once they found out that something is definitely tribe, only then will they start to say, okay, and is it thinking or is it feeling? And then there's another issue, which is about reasons versus values. How do you determine something is reasons versus values? Well, you've already made it all about tribes. You've already flavored the discussion. So it's all about tribal reasons versus tribal values. And it's hard to really determine what a tribal reason is versus a tribal value. It's far easier if you say, okay, thinking, is what's already quite explicit rather than implicit. It's something that doesn't require interpretation. It's something which is grounded in the facts in some way, in some sort of objectivity, some sort of stake of knowledge. Whereas values, as it were, or feeling at least, should be something which is more sentimental. And there should be clear differences in one being sentimental and the other one being more fact-oriented. Once you make it about the tribe and people, that becomes a lot more difficult, because people don't necessarily share facts so easily. People do share feelings very easily. You see the emotional contagion. Whereas facts is already accumulated in a way from a sort of individual sort of basis. I take in these facts, you may take in some different facts. You even have to compare and contrast our facts. It's a more difficult process. It's not a natural flow that sweeps the whole population all at once. It's not really designed really to be tribe if you really think about it. So that becomes difficult. And also, it then also implies that suddenly those who are introverted thinking and introverted feeling are then far more about the self rather than the tribe. And again, that becomes quite difficult to imagine. So you're saying that if you are someone who thinks out some sort of logically constructed system, all in its own basic principles, that you're only keeping that for yourself, you're not thinking about how that can also benefit other people around you. Is there no such thing as the sort of Zarathustras of the world who come down from the mountain after the time thinking off on their own, and they then want to share their wisdom with the world? Is that not something that's a bit more tribish, not just selfish? That's what I find very peculiar, and opens up a bit of it opens up many more questions in my opinion. Now, another thing I'd like to talk about is about the use of the term organising. That's used for introverted observation, that you're organising different concepts. It implies a certain need for some sort of structure. The thing about organising, what do you do when you're organising? You're not just limiting your scope. You're not just filtering out, which I think is a more accurate term, filtering. No, when you're organising, you are looking at things, you're applying a schema to put that in some sort of order. Now, a schema is a decision. So if you're saying that observing, your word for perception is observing, rather than deciding, why would you then use a term like organising of observations, which is implicitly about making decisions about how and where things should go? Why would you apply that to observations rather than to decisions? It again reaches some sort of contradiction, and it can be very, very confusing. Now, and I think it's also why it leads to some sort of weird meanings of certain other cognitive functions. We were talking about introverted sensation, and I was talking about this with Binyamin, and Binyamin didn't gel with what I was talking about introverted sensation. So sociolog's definition is more about a sort of harmony in the moment. It's about really taking in and being satisfied with one's sensory experiences, refining those experiences to be most enjoyable, most harmonious again, most pleasurable, most convenient, smooth running, minimal waste of resources in doing it. That's what introverted sensation makes sense to me, that sort of refinement of sensation. Very much still rooted in the day-to-day, rooted in physical, concrete experiences. Whereas you find the introverted sensation in objective personality, it's not talking about things rooted in the day-to-day. It's thinking of concepts such as meaning, what has come before in some way, one's set organisation of these said facts, as it were, some way of thinking which is particularly meaningful. And we bring up the word meaningful. That's confusing. What is meaning? Meaning conveys something that's a bit more abstract. It's something which goes beyond the day-to-day. It's something which, when you think of meaning already, you're looking up. You're looking up for some sort of reason, some sort of why behind the what. It's not something which you find in the day-to-day. There's a clear separation between the things of meaning and the things of what. Why and what. So why would it be sneaking that into introverted sensation? It becomes very confusing. And if that's the case, it suggests to me that they've arrived at sort of arcane definitions of these different cognitive functions which don't make much internal sense and don't really match up to reality. Well, they don't make much internal sense. They don't match up to our collectively recognized archetypes. Now, Binyamin say, oh, well, this is how we have just observed things to work. And Binyamin says this a lot. He said, this is how I have observed things to work. And so if I have observed it to work this way, therefore it must be true. But I've observed it to work completely differently. Am I observing less well than you're observing? Maybe I'm, a false observer. Maybe I'm delusional. Maybe you are the only one who's right in terms of your observations. Only you see reality for what it really is. And that becomes a bit contentious again. Now, what I would more likely say is you've had certain schema in your head and you're seeing things the way in which you want to see them. And I could very well have certain schema in my head and I could be seeing things the way I want to see them. But at least for me, I can also look at these collectively recognized archetypes, these clear stock characters, these figures in our shared fictions, and I can say, look, you can see this going on. You can see people recognize this. They show this in their different works of art and their different works of film and literature. Why is that not? Why not turn to that and look at that rather than saying you've observed something and you've observed that to be true, and therefore even if it doesn't make much, even if it's completely counterintuitive, it must be true. I'd like to think that I have a bit more humility in my understanding, and I like to think that, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Why do I have to think that I've always observed reality in a way which is right and true? I could be biased. Humanity is open to bias. The whole point of science, the whole point where we have peer review, which for some reason the many enthusiasts of objective personality seem to have rejected to some degree. The whole point we have peer review is that it is a means of correcting our perceptions, our difficulties in objectivity. And kudos to Dave and Shannon for having this cross reference. But again, even 2 people is not enough. You're going to even 3 people is not enough. If you have a group of people who all share the same ways of viewing things, that can lead to group bias, and that is a real thing. We can see group bias happening when certain groups have a certain shared way of viewing things. That could be self-contained bias. We know about this. That's why you need people who actually are independent. People who are not part of your group to actually go and cross-check. And that's something which objective personality, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, objective personality hasn't reached people outside of objective personality to cross-check their analyses. Now, I know that can also be difficult. If you're trained to spot certain cues, you can only get that by being inside the fold. But then again, that is the what's the word? That is the knot that needs to be untied, and it's a difficult one, a very difficult one. So again, there's a difficulty there. Now, one thing which I thought was quite interesting, which came out a bit later, was about feminine versus masculine. Now, this is an interesting idea. So it's the idea that you could be an extroverted sensation leading type. Now, you could be completely different to another extroverted sensation leading type. One extroverted sensation type, a bit like your typical sort of Trump figure, or I don't know, a sort of or Mike Tyson, very assertive, very dominant, very much about dominating their environment. But that would be more of a masculine example of extroverted sensation. The extroverted sensation which doesn't budge on the observations it's made. But there's another sort of extroverted sensation, the feminine kind of extroverted sensation. This is the exact opposite. This one's always budging on the observations it's made. It's often changing its mind. It's often very malleable and can actually give in to other people's input. It's actually not quite subordinate, not particularly dominant. Now that's quite interesting. You have almost 2 completely opposite behaviors, but they both can identify as being extroverted sensation. Now you could give them the benefit of the doubt and say, oh, we know them to be extroverted sensation based on how we defined it, but they are simply manifesting such a different way that we have to call it 2 different things. Or you can say, oh, I've got a weird typing here and I found a way to sort of cover it up, make it less empirically falsifiable. Do the same thing with astrology and natal charts. If you don't match up to the sun sign, oh, well, maybe there's something in Mercury that's a bit askew. Maybe your moon sign is a bit funny. So yeah, again, it opens a whole can of worms. And I'm looking at videos of, say, people who are extroverted thinking, but they are feminine extroverted thinking. And when I think of someone, if you're going to have a top function, that's meant to be the thing which you are meant to be seeing the world through. It's going to be the thing which you find most important in your life. It's going to be a place of, at least I would say, a place of confidence, a place of focus, and other parts be less confident, which could trip you up. You would think that that would be what they would describe as masculine all the time. And when we show the feminine, it leads to very counterintuitive behaviors. You have someone who's supposedly extroverted thinking in the top dominant position, and she easily has her mind made up by other people and feels almost powerless to really think things through for herself. She just ends up going along with other people who have thought through for her. Is that an extroverted thinking type in the leading? It's very counterintuitive. Now, the reason why you end up typing them as this in objective personality, because as Binyamin very clearly said in the debate, it's not about strength, it's not about weakness, that's not what it's about. The only ideas of strength really come from being more of a jack of all trades, by being a double decider or a double perceiver. By being a double decider and therefore a single perceiver, or a double observer and a single decider, yeah, take a single decider, extroverted thinking at the top. That is not going to be a strong thing. You're focusing so much on extroverted thinking that you're not doing the introverted feeling. And therefore, extroverted thinking without introverted feeling is weak. It's overly focused, it's overly done in that particular way, and therefore it's extreme and carries certain vulnerabilities. And okay, I say, okay, there is some truth to that. There is some truth that by having psychological asymmetry, that's going to make you weak. But it's not going to make you weak in the extroverted thinking of your extroverted thinking type. It's going to make you weak in the introverted feeling, because that's the thing being ignored. So why are you then saying that there are these now female versions of these leading cognitive functions, which are so malleable, so able to be changed and dominated by other people? That is very confusing. Socionics explains this in a more straightforward way. It says, okay, if you are an introverted feeling type, if that is in the top position, then your extroverted thinking is going to be far less confident, and so you'll be far more suggestible to the input of other people on extroverted logic, extroverted thinking. That makes sense to me. It means you have your area, that's your area of strength, that's your area of confidence, and the other area, the thing which is put down, which is less of your focus because you're focused so much in this top area, it makes sense. So that would be down there. That would be the thing which is more suggestible. That is the thing be more malleable to other people's input, and that's what we did. That's why we say that those which are leading, that's an inert, a stubborn function, and the suggestive function is a flexible contact function. It's something which is open to other people's input, and that makes sense. It makes sense for duality and how the different types come together, because you need your dual to be far more confident and more decisive in this area to then help you out, because you're not very indecisive in this particular area. Whereas now you have a situation with these sorts of, and to me it seems sort of pathetic in some way, that to have a type where its leading function is going to be something which is very suggestible, very subordinate, having other people making up its mind for it. And that's your leading function, that's what you're all about? My goodness gracious, that's terrifying to be so in that way. I feel so sorry for such a person. I don't think that's really the situation. I think they have an area of strength, but the way the typology has framed it, it's made their weaker area, their area of unconfidence, the thing which they're all about, and it then ends up burying their actual strengths being introverted feeling. And that is quite sad. And you can see videos of this poor girl on this video talking about her being an extroverted thinking feminine, and she's nearly bursting into tears from other people making up her mind for her. It's terrible. It's awful to hear about, and to find that quality, that very sad quality, is the main thing of who they are when viewed through the lens of this objective personality system. That is quite devastating to hear. I'd like a typology system which actually recognizes the strengths of people and brings that out in understanding of people. That would make far more sense to me. That is you got your strong point, you got your home base where you can start off from, your hero as it were. How's that heroic? You need your hero. And from there you can then move on to actually take on other areas, develop other areas, and grow as a person. So where is this path for growth for objective personality? If you take the very first starting point, say it's feminine, call it feminine, and and to say feminine is far more suggestible, far more sort of weak and maneuverable, and make that, your starting point. That's no starting point. That is a weak point. So, yeah. I still think there are lots of difficulties with objective personality. I don't think Binyamin was able to really answer those and make a convincing point against those. Now, of course, listen to his points now. He's very free to watch this video, and then, of course, he can make his own response, and he can take me to task on that, and I would welcome that very strongly. Very strongly welcome that. I hope he does. I hope other people are very free to offer their thoughts as well. These are my criticisms at the moment. If you have a way of thinking about this which answers these criticisms, makes sense of them, which makes a way that vindicates objective personality in a convincing way, I'm very open to it. As I said in my debate with Binyamin, if you can make a strong enough argument for objective personality, while at the same time finding ways in which objective personality answers questions which sociology is unable to answer, that is when I would be willing to give up socionics entirely and move towards objective personality, or find some theory in the middle between objective personality and socionics, which has the best of both, while also being internally consistent and being a theory which makes internal coherence and sense. I would like that to happen, and I challenge anyone to help me to reach that point if they want me to get to that point. Thank you.